cho sampo pa gyu tra shi pa tu che tempe trin le yar ngo da pel ge tro lor zampe zebra che pande la me shabla sol wa de om a guru vajra dara sumati muni shasane kar Uta Vardanya Shri Bhadra Varsa Manya Sarva Siddhi Hum Oma Guru Vajra Dara Sumati Muni Shasani Uta Vardanya Shri Bhadra Varsa Manya Sarva Siddhi Hum Oma Guru Vajra Dara Sumati Muni Shasani Kar Uta Vardanya Shri Bhadra Varsa Manya Sarva Siddhi Hum Oma Guru Vajra Dara Sumati Munishas Uta Vardanya Shri Bhadra Varsa Manya Sarva Siddhi Hum Oma Guru Vajra Dara Sumati Munish Vardanya Shri Bhadra Varsa Manya Sarva Siddhi Hum Dagi Jetsun Lama Tuje Che Nyamda Dala Tuje Siksu So Gebe Shesan Dala Tendo So Uyon Sunge Nawa Tsedo So Tsechi Nyingne Sowa Debe Tse Dejen Korlo Visu Lekshu Yila Sambe Duden Malupa Gemel Hungi Drubra Jingi Lo Tsoni Sodan Dikdun Shabe Tse Dungi Namge Yinsu Lekshu Ne Lapchen Tsoni Yonso Chera Nyetun Chamra Jingil, Chancho Pargin Yinsen Tukun to New Pemesio Dru Lecture, Chancho Drube Gegen Kunshi Shi, Tunken de la Drubra Jing, Dagi Lona Chola Chokpa Dan Chemin Samjurangimba Shiwa, Chedan Tumbe Dudun Malupa, Bemel Hungi Drubra Jingil, Dorna Tingne Terava Tamche Dan, Techi Pardune Gav Tamchet. Rese Kyamne Lama Kele Me Tukje Chingi Dala Siksus Gongyab Drewe Nyamda Dachala Jetsun La Me Tuje Rabgongne Kodan Sungi Nawa Drame Tu Nyamsunyo Me Kesan Kewa Kundu Yanda Lama Dan Rame Chekipe La Longche Sadan Lamge Yende Rabzon Dorje Change Kopa Nyor Tobe Sho Pakyuke akudan dagi alu, pakyuke sundan dagi nga, pakyuke atudan dagi yi, ten yerme çiktu çingi alu, makyuke kudan dagi alu. Ke sundan da gi ma köke tukdan da gi ten yerme çıktı çingi lo amuni amuni maha Shakyamuni Swaha Om Muni tochi dagi jinso gibe sonam ki drola pinchira sange drupare shu sange chodan tsoge chonam la chancho pardo dani dagi jinso gibe sonam ki drola pinchira sange drupare shu sange chodan tsoge chonam la chancho pardo dani dagi jinso gibe sonam ki drola pinchira sange drupare shu.
In the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the practice of generosity and the other perfections, may I obtain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings.
In the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment. Through the practice of generosity and the other perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Laye ke dan ludan jinke rubudan da mi ke namdam rawa kunge dranam chitsampa thamche ke tu dage cheten.
Good morning. At the end of the 11th century in Tibet, I think closer towards the 12th century, the beginning of the 12th century, there was a master named Geshe Chekawa. Geshe Chekawa was very important. When it's he who wrote down for the first time formally the path called Lojong, mind training. The path to train oneself with compassion, altruism, and wisdom, just in a few words. In one of his texts, there's a verse that I read once that really inspired me. He said, "The mind is full of defects, but it has one great quality. What you teach it, it will follow, the mind follows." And I recognize there are two different ways to live our life. Probably we go from one to the other. It would be hard to be 100% one or the other. Ideally, one would move from one completely to the other. The first way, modality, is where we live every situation, our thoughts, and as a consequence, our words, our actions, our choices, etc., are reactions to what happens. Or rather, we live as if we were a victim. We live the world as if, okay, things are like this, I'm here, I'm living these experiences, and I have nothing to do with these situations, really. I'm a victim. I don't know if that's really the right word, but you understand, right? I'm like a victim here. a victim of what happens, and I simply react. So I have these emotions based on this situation. I say that this is because of that, and we go on and on in this kind of automatic way without directing ourselves, really. The other way is where instead we observe the situations that happen, but instead of reacting, we do what we can to be aware of our own dynamics, and we try to act with awareness towards what we want to become. In a few words, one way is reacting, and the other one is acting with awareness, with mindfulness. To be able to act mindfully is to have this awareness. The first thing we need is being able to observe ourselves, to see what happens. A little bit like, just imagine if we have to direct and guide someone else. For example, a child or even adult. The first thing that we need to do is observe. The first thing that we need to be able to do is to see the other person, see the processes that evolve, see what is happening. And once we're able to see the other, after some time, after some observation, then we can almost foresee what is going to happen. And at that point, we can direct and say, okay, be careful, stop, that's not very good, try to do differently, don't do like that, don't do like this. But the first thing that we need is to observe. And to be able to observe, we need also somehow to know, understand these mechanisms that are present. Try to give you an example. Let's imagine a car. Could be any kind of vehicle. We see the car that goes from one point to another. One thing is simply seeing that object that moves. Another thing is knowing how the car works and understand that as this object that is moving, there's fuel, there are all the different parts of the motor, there's someone driving the car. I mean, having that understanding, I can perceive aspects that I could understand that there's somebody driving, see that person driving, maybe even understand the mood of the person who's driving. The more I'm able to understand how it's working, then the deeper I can go in observing the details. And once we know the details, we can direct in a more specific way. And in our life, the same thing happens. Our ability to observe, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that we need to learn. Observe many things. For example, our body, in reality, is constantly giving us signals of what is happening. I always remember once I went to Nepal to see a doctor, Manovajra. He at that time was an Ayurvedic doctor of the king at the time, and he was a very, very traditional. He's a very good doctor, and in spite of being a great, respected doctor, he received his patients in a very, very small studio, and so he had a small chair, a little bed for the patient and a drape that he would open and close. And then just not even 2 meters outside the drape, there were other people who were waiting, a kind of makeshift waiting room, no privacy. And once I went to him, someone came and he looked at the other person and said, well, what about you, the person who came to accompany me? That person said, oh, no, I've just come to accompany him. But then the doctor said, but don't you have this, that, and the other? Don't you have these symptoms? And he was able to capture a perfect photograph of this person's state of health. And then he explained, because you have this and that and the other, almost like being clairvoyant. And he said, I look at your face and your expression. As you spoke, I saw your tongue. I saw the way you walked. And he really captured perfectly the person's health. So our body, our face shows so many things that normally we're not able to see because we don't know the mechanisms well enough. Even our feelings, our emotions, they are shown on our body if we knew how to read them well. Anyway, the point that I want to get to is we need to develop more and more the ability for self-awareness of our body, speech, and mind, and in the end, this is one of the reasons why we study the mind. This doesn't take away the importance of studying the body or understanding our speech, to know and understand. As we said at the beginning, mind and body are directly connected. And this made me think of something. I'm going to say it, otherwise it just stays stuck inside and it takes up some room in my head. Some time ago, I saw a video of a Spanish lady who has this activity that she developed together with photographs of self-portraits. It's someone who lived great difficulties in her life, without getting into all the details of her difficulties, but she's someone who really struggled and was able to overcome a heavy addiction to drugs, etc. And one of the things that she did was use photographs as self-portraits. And she was showing that when we take the photo of someone and then we see half of the face, we see the two halves of the face, they're very different. And each side of the face shows us aspects of ourself. And the path that she does is helping us to recognize our emotions, aspects of ourselves, by looking at our own image. And this, I remember this because if we knew how to observe, there are so many things that they go by, how can I say, unknown is not the right word, unobserved. And if we were instead able to bring those things to our awareness, we would be able to give a direction, they would help us give a direction to ourselves. And now I allow myself to open and close parentheses and to do a little advertising. I'm very happy that we were able to invite this lady here to Albagnano, and she should come the last weekend of January. the 28th, 29th of January. Gabriella, is that right? She manages our program, and and um, and it seems something really beautiful because she does something very connected to what we consider in Buddhism the correct view of reality, the value that we give to ourselves using photography. And I think here in the center, having activities, people who show the same thing from a different point of view really helps us. So it's a special opportunity, and if we're able to be present, I think it's something wonderful, because the teachings are very important, the various practices we have as well. But when we see someone who says the same things or similar things from a different perspective, this helps us understand things that maybe that we hadn't really understood. Her name is Christina Nunes. First, I went to see her work, and I was really positively taken by her approach. This approach that helps us understand who we are through this reading of our own faces. Because I don't know how many of us are able to look at ourselves and observe ourselves and see to see what kind of signals we are actually emitting out in the world. When we're able to see that, we can then direct them. So this self-awareness, because our body too is constantly sending signals about how we are physically, what our emotions are. More than once, I remember that someone had gone to Lama Ganchen and to ask a blessing or something, saying that they had a strong headache or some other kind of pain. In this case, I remember the person had a headache, and Rinpoche, he said to Rinpoche, because every time I get angry, I get a bad headache. And Rinpoche said, you see, your body is your greatest master, showing you that you can't afford to get angry. So our body tells us really what's going on inside, and it's important for us to be able to observe so that we can then redirect. Along this process of self-awareness, we start with the awareness of our body, and then to the awareness of our speech, to get to the awareness of our mind. And the more we know the mechanisms of our own mind, the better we'll be able to observe it. As we said yesterday, our mind is a flow of thoughts. It's a flow of feeling, of sensation, of objects that are perceived, and we have our six senses. This flow is constant. There's no beginning or end. Actually, there's one subject studied. There are 5 main subjects of philosophy, and one is the part of logic, Sema Nandral in Tibetan, and within that there's a part where there are the logical reasonings, for example, how to prove reincarnation. When we talk about reincarnation, one way to see reincarnation is seeing the flow of the mind that doesn't have a beginning, the flow of thoughts. So if you go backwards, you can't get to a first thought. And theoretically, if you go backwards, you can even go to before this actual life. But in any way, if we're here today observing our mind, we can't find a beginning. It's a thought, literally one thought attached to another, one that gives life to another. They're not disconnected. But to be able to observe, we need somehow, as we said yesterday, create these boxes. We need somehow to underline and highlight, because when we observe something, in reality what we're seeing is a union of parts, but we're the ones who attribute a name, and we make that union of parts an entity, and we similarly we take parts of our mind and we give a name. And so we've divided up to be able to observe it. So we've divided up the mind into primary minds, and we've seen there are those that have a valid cognition, those have non-valid cognitions. The difference is that is valid, that which perceives the object in a coherent way, where the object is able to sustain uphold the characteristics and functions of that object. Instead, a cognition is non-valid when the name is not able to uphold the functions and characteristics of that given name. So then every primary mind is made up of these mental factors that compose it, and there are 51 of these mental factors. The first 5 are 5, we call them, that go with all omnipresent mental factors. They are always there. It's not that sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. These 5 are always present. All of the other mental factors can be present or not. They don't have to be there. But these first 5 are always there. Let's see them again quickly. So we have feeling, discernment, we have intention, attention, and contact. Contact is this aspect of our mind that activates the sense power. So when we perceive something, anything, any thought that we have, any state of our mind has this union of these 3 things. Sense object, which can be one of the 5 external sense objects, can be visual, it can be sound, it can be taste, etc. The word that's used often is phenomenon, but we use, to simplify a little bit, we use this term mental image, which is what we're able to perceive with our mind, the 6th. Then we have the sense powers that are actually physical. So what's interesting, that even for our mental image, for our mental power, it depends on something physical. So the sense power of the mind is our brain, and not only, it's what allows us to project the future, to have emotions, to look back at a memory. What we imagine is based on a physical aspect, and there's a great part of that comes from the actual brain, but from my understanding, not only the brain, but there are many other parts of the body that serve as a basis to the mind. As we see, like any kind of hormonal imbalance, that would change our mood. Hormones are caused by other parts of the body, right? Not just the brain. Just look at the thyroid, just to name one. So, so that we can say that the mind is connected to the thyroid, yes. And with every other part of our body, with our liver, our heart, intestine, etc. So, so the sense power is important. So let's remember, we're talking about something physical. And then we also have a sense consciousness. So this mental factor of contact is this part of our mind that activates and perceives the signals that come to our sense power. So there's light that comes to my eyes, the form that comes to the eye, the sense power. The eyes receive those signals, and then the visual consciousness, the sense consciousness, perceives this. And the union of these three is called contact. At the same time, contact is also the part of our mind that activates the sense power. Yesterday, we saw this in quite detail. Contact is the basis for sensation, for feeling. So when there's contact, what happens inevitably? Feeling, sensation. This feeling is that which allows us to experience that object. It's through the feeling that we experience the object. All feelings that are pleasurable, when they arise, we want that feeling to remain, and when they end, we want them to come back. Those are what we call pleasant feeling. Unpleasant, suffering feelings, call it what you want. Those are all the sensations that we have that when they are present, we want them to end as soon as possible. And when they do end, we don't want them to come back. And then we have neutral feelings. And they can be, when they're there, we don't care if they're there or not, if they end, if they come back, if they don't come back. And feelings, we have also feelings that come through our visual contact, through our hearing, through our taste, etc. So multiplied by 3, we have 18 different types of sensation. Sensation is also where we experience the result of our actions. In other words, where we experience the ripening of our karma. If we see this from a different perspective, it's when we come into contact with an object and live a feeling. So contact, actual contact, what happens? That contact came from nothing, or instead it's the result of a very complex interaction of interactions and choices, etc., that brought me to be in contact with that object. Because let's remember that contact is not just the object, but it also has to do with the sense power and the sense consciousness. So when I perceive something and have a feeling, the result of that feeling is not a result of the object only, but also the result of my sense power and the state of my sense consciousness. The same type of object perceived in different times, that brings different experiences, different results. So when there is contact, the basis for feeling, sensation, it's the result of an enormous complexity of thing, and not separated from everything else. So with no doubt, we can say that contact is a result of interactions, of choices, or we can say karma. It's where we experience the ripening of our karma, our actions, our interactions, the ripening of our interactions. So we experience the ripening of our karma through our feeling coming from contact. We said yesterday that feeling also have a function, and I just add before explaining, this is something that is not, I've never seen this in Buddhist texts. This is based on my own reflection, but I think it's important, at least for me, that feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, they have an important um, um, they have an importance for our survival, to our survival. And if we didn't have feeling, we wouldn't be alive as a species. It's what pushes us to eat. The fact that that eating is pleasant and hunger is unpleasant, because if if I eat and I find it unpleasant, I won't look for food. I wouldn't look for food, etc. We can give many, just billions of examples. So, so feelings have a function. So we shouldn't simply try in our lives to look and sustain pleasant feelings and eliminate all unpleasant feelings, but understand, recognize the message that's behind. When there's an unpleasant feeling, it means that there's something that's not balanced, something that is out of place for our way of interacting with our body, with society around us, with our own mechanisms, our own inner dynamics, our own thoughts. When we have a view that doesn't match reality, that generates suffering. Instead, when it matches, then it brings well-being. So, pleasant or unpleasant feelings are like a red flag. And yesterday we concluded by saying there are 4 types of objects. We can take the objects of the 6 senses and we can divide them, multiply them depending on how you want to see it, in 4 different types. We have objects that with the first contact, they're pleasant, but in keeping contact with that object, it brings more suffering, so it's detrimental. Then we have objects that at first contact they're pleasant, and keeping contact with that object, they increase our happiness and well-being, and so they're beneficial. Then we have objects that at first contact the feeling is unpleasant, but mid and long term they're good for us. Or maybe at first contact they're unpleasant, but long term, mid-long term, they're also they're harmful. In other words, there are pleasant things that are good for us, and there are pleasant feelings that are good for us, pleasant feelings that are bad for us, unpleasant feelings that are good for us, unpleasant feelings that are good for us or that are bad for us. And we don't have to worry about those that are pleasant and that are good for us, or unpleasant and that are bad for us, because instead we need to be more careful with the others. And a more mature person is not looking so much as to whether the feeling is pleasant or unpleasant, but is more cautious about whether that feeling is beneficial or detrimental. So what if something is pleasant but is bad for me? We need to avoid contact with that thing. Instead, what is unpleasant and it brings suffering, we avoid. And instead, what is unpleasant and is good for us, we need to cultivate the contact with that. And this is interesting. When something is unpleasant, is good for us, as we cultivate it, then it actually becomes pleasurable, the experience. And let me just add something. I think, I mean, what I've understood, the reason why something that is good for us is unpleasant at the beginning is because we are not balanced ourselves. When a person is in a balanced state and is naturally attracted to what is beneficial, when a person is emotionally, socially, mentally, physically is not in equilibrium, that person is attracted to what will increase that imbalance. Like a doctor told me once, he asked his patients, the very first thing he asked his patients is what they like to eat the most. And the example he used was watermelon. If a patient said watermelon, then I say, you need to avoid watermelon. Then we'll understand why later. But when we're unbalanced, we're attracted to that which increases that imbalance. Let's find an example. A state of respect, gratitude, love, altruism. Is that beneficial or is it detrimental? I mean, the more satisfaction we have, the more love and gratitude, respect, humbleness, gratitude. I mean, the better off we are. But when we're strongly taken by anger and selfishness, being in front of that object of anger or any other situation, but the object of anger is usually very strong. But acting with love or altruism, is that easy or difficult? Not only is it difficult, but it's actually suffering. It's unpleasant, but it is good for us. The more we go forward with that, the more one is in balance, then the more pleasurable it becomes. So feelings, we should look at them first of all like an alarm, but at the same time we should be careful to not be attached to these sensations. See them as signs and not as end in and of themselves. Because the more attached we are to feelings, to sensations, the more we act in short term and not mid-long term. Now, yesterday we opened discernment. Let's pick up again discernment. Discernment is this other mental factor that is greatly important. It can say that of all the mental factors, the two that are the most important are feeling and discernment, as Buddha highlighted. When he described the being, he said the being is made up of form, body, made up of feeling, sensation, discernment, composed mental factors, all the other mental factors, and consciousness. So feeling and discernment are given the most importance because the majority of our conflicts, our suffering, arises from our attachment to feeling and to discernment. Discernment is the part of our mind that observes the object. Remember that there's always contact. So there's contact. Once there's contact, signals come to our mind, and we research in our previous experiences, our concepts that we have accumulated, our sort of inner database, and we look to find what is similar to what we have in front of us. And we take one of those and we attribute that to that object that's in front of us. And when we attribute that name, that is called discernment. We choose characteristics, specific characteristics and general, or rather, we take specific characteristics, we put them together in a way to generalize, to say, this is a chair. This is an act of love. This is an act of hate. There are thousands of ways to perceive things. So the definition here of Sangha is, what are the defining characteristics of discernment? Discernment is the mental factor that functions to know by the gathering of specific and general aspects of a given object, by way of seeing, listening, differentiating, and cognizing in order to label that object. Here, when it says by way of seeing or listening, differentiating, and cognizing, one is that we use the information that we've already acquired from what we've seen, what we've heard, what we ourselves have analyzed, and the general perceptions of our senses that we've previously lived. Mental images that we use to attribute to an object can be divided into two types. The mental images are tunchi and dachi in Tibetan. The general mental images and specific from sound. An example is, if I tell you something, the first time I gave this example, something came to my mind. Anyway, let's take anything. Imagine something. For example, Lama Michel Rinpoche, years ago, we were in Borobudur in Indonesia, and at a certain point, I'm not going to tell all the details, but there were the conditions, and he wanted some land to make a kind of center for us in Borobudur, and someone was there, and that created the conditions for someone to say, well, why don't we make a Borobudur in Brazil? And then they started building this Borobudur in Brazil. So imagine Minas Gerais, no buildings whatsoever, beautiful, beautiful place. There's a high hill with a 360-degree view, many trees, and there was first a structure, a mound of land was first built, and then a structure like 2 meters by 2 meters high, 9 meters, within and inside many, many sacred objects were filled up. And as this was being built, they were making different they were using this very, very red earth, the soil from Brazil, and as they were creating this central mandala for Borobudur, Lama Ganchen was there, filling it with crystals, etc. So it hasn't been finished, but there's a marvelous energy. You know, there's some of you who are here have been there. For those of you who were there, you have a mental image that was created by what? By what you saw, but what you heard, what you smelled, what you touched, all the senses together, that you reinforce this mental image. And this is tunchi. This is a generalized image. For those of you who were not there, just from what I said, that I told, the mental image that you created was created exclusively on what I said, drachi. It's generalized sound. So you have a mental image, you have an idea that doesn't come from a sensorial experience, but by what you have been told or what you've heard. So when we're in front of an object and we have this inner research, we have what we've seen, what we have actually lived, and then also things that we have heard, and then all the inner elaborations. Because this happens too every once in a while. We've seen something, we've lived something else, and then we have a memory of something. We've created, yet another mental image. So here we see seeing, listening, differentiating, and cognizing. These are different aspects where how we create these mental images. Some are from direct experience, or we've come into contact with that object through listening. Others we've elaborated within. So that we can label the object. The mind of discernment is the part of our mind that is always present, that gives a name to things. And remember that giving a name to something means attributing characteristics and functions to something. Once I was talking to an art critic, and I asked, what makes something art? And the answer he gave me is, art is what you call art. So even the banana that's taped to the canvas, I don't know who's seen that. It last year, I think, it was in all the newspapers at the Biennale of Venice. It was like 100,000 euro, 100,000 euro piece of art, and it was a banana taped to a canvas. And buying it, one had, I guess, the right to eat the banana. It's a modern example that shows you that phenomena are empty of inherent existence. But what happens is, when we're in front of an object, inevitably we relate with that thing, inevitably through the value that we give to it. There's a part of our mind that is constantly observing, reflecting, researching, and labeling. And I want to take advantage quickly. When we're young, or when we're in a context that is new for us, we're open to knowing, learning. We're open to observing, to receive information, where before giving a name to something, that first discernment is, I don't know. Okay, I look at the forms, I look at the colors, and I try to give that thing a name. What are the functions? What are the characteristics of this novelty? And so we enter in this process of knowing. As we go forward, the second time we find ourselves in front of a similar object, I don't open myself up to the possibilities of knowing, but I re-know, I recognize. And as we go as the years go on, very rarely do we learn something new. Instead, we're in that constant process of recognizing, and we take for granted that those things are things that we have already experienced in the past, and we're upset when they don't correspond. Instead, it's important for us to be open to knowing, understand that what I have in front of me has characteristics that are similar to what I've seen or experienced in the past, but it's not the same. Allow ourselves to know, allow ourselves to observe the various characteristics. And we're here the definition of discernment, where it says through general, specific and general aspects. Let's take the example of this glass. The general characteristics are those that correspond to all glasses. The specific ones are the ones that correspond to this object. As time goes by, we have this tendency to relate to situations and objects of perception more through the general characteristics instead of specific ones. Is that clear? Here is the importance of observing our own discernment and understanding. I'm attributing this value to this object, but have I generalized, or have I taken into consideration also the specific aspects? It's important to look again, try to see other perspectives of the same object, allow ourselves to know it. For example, many times I've had a kind of experience that made me reflect a lot, having to do with sound. Someone speaks to me. Once, for example, I was in the United States together with Kuten Lama, who was here not too long ago, and we were together, and he brought me to the airport, and as we were waiting, we were drinking some tea, and he asked me something. He said something to me. I said, what is, how can he be saying this to me? It seemed something incredibly offensive. I said, how's that possible? That's so strange. And then I could pretend I didn't understand. I don't answer. And then he asked me the same question. I thought, wow, this is so strange that he would say something like that to me. I didn't say anything at all. And then for the third time, he repeated it. I said, wow, I have to say something. When I was about to answer, inside, I made a kind of process of of pause, rewind, play, that memory of the sound, and I realized that he was speaking Tibetan and English mixed in, and the question was just if I wanted milk with my tea. But as I was listening, I was listening as if it were only Tibetan without the English mixed in. And in English, and it seemed, if it had been only Tibetan, it would have had a totally different meaning. So when someone speaks to us, what arrives to our ears, those are sounds, and we attribute meaning to those sounds. Many times I've had to do this pause, rewind, go back, and hear again what was said. Was it really what I think I heard? And this is very important. It allows us to perceive that things are not so obvious as they appear to us. So in our discernment, try not to stay just on the general, but to go to the specific. Try to listen better, to see that there are things that are different than compared to our previous experiences. And what's interesting about discernment is that it's through discernment that we construct most of the reality in which we live. It's in feeling that we experience reality, and it's discernment where we we construct our worldview, our paradigm. Because if I attribute a value or another, in reality, that changes a lot. If you asked me if I wanted milk or if you offended me, the emotions that I live are different. My reaction is different. What happens inside me is different. Imagine if I hadn't understood that he had mixed up the English and the Tibetan. Maybe I wouldn't have said anything. I would have pretended that I hadn't understood, but I would have been left with that thought of, why did he want to offend me? Or look at this Lama. Instead, he asked me if I wanted milk with my tea. So discernment changes our perception, and the reality that we live is a very important point. And Buddha said that we need to be careful to not be attached to discernment. We have this tendency to have a strong attachment, not just to feelings, sensation, but also to discernment. Attachment to discernment. Sorry, excuse me. Attachment to discernment, it manifests mostly once we come into contact with a sensory object. We attribute a name, a meaning. We label that experience. Okay? This labeling can be from one of our senses, or we can have a discernment that sums up. I'm seeing someone, I'm listening to his voice, there's smell, there's the tactile feeling. In any case, the attachment to discernment comes when I have attributed a value to the object that I perceive, not being aware that the value that I attributed, I think that that label is reality and cannot be different. So we're not open to different points of view. We're not open to other possibilities, because what I see is not, because the value that I attribute is reality. And this is the attachment to discernment that we can have. Many conflicts, sufferings come from this. All right? Let's remember that in the same way, what I hear, I attribute meaning. What I see, those are just forms and color to which I attribute a meaning. Smells, tastes, touch, etc. It's the same identical thing. So discernment is this mental factor where we somehow we construct our worldview and our experience. Is discernment clear? What happens is this. When we have a discernment, for the example that I gave before, I was there, a friend says something to me, he asked me if I wanted milk in my tea. I understood it as an insult. When I attribute that value and I see it as an insult, the object or better. When I hear this sound, that's an auditory consciousness that brought us a feeling, a sensation. When I attribute that value, what's the object of perception? Is this sound or is it a mental image? It's a mental image. So it's a feeling, a sensation that is no longer auditory, but it's a mental feeling. So I have this feeling that is unpleasant, that doesn't come actually from the sound itself, but from the label that I gave to that sound. And when I change that mental object, we have a different feeling. And this shows us that often we generate a suffering. We generate suffering, thinking that it's based on the object that we are and coming into contact with, when instead it's fruit of the mental
Non è un conflitto fra la sensazione e il discernimento, Daphne, è il conflitto fra
so here
l'esperienza sensoriale
there's
e il valore attribuito.
There's an sensory experience and then the value, the given. So that's where the conflict is. I have a pleasurable experience from the sound, but I attribute a meaning that is unpleasant, negative, and from that I experience an unpleasant feeling. Where there's no correspondence is not between sensation and discernment, because they're two separate primary minds. One perceives the sound, and the other is a mind, in this case, that attributes a specific meaning. The object of perception is no longer the auditory object, but it's a mental object. So it doesn't happen at the same time. First one and then the other. I hear him speaking. As he speaks, in that first moment, discernment that comes together with that auditory consciousness is based on sound. When I attribute a meaning and said, oh, he's saying this instead of that, that's a new perception, a new discernment, new sensation, etc. They're not simultaneous. Discernment, what happens is this. Our mind, as I said before, is a constant flow. Because even if we look in our own experience, when someone says something to us, if we get close, there is a difference between the moment of the sound and, oh, you said this with this intention. When we're learning a new language, that process is slower. So the important point here is for us to be able to observe that many of our sensations, feelings, don't derive from the sensory object, external sensory object, objective, let's say, objectively, but come actually from an inner object that is based on the value that we have attributed. And this helps us this connects us to what we were talking about yesterday, that when we're in nature, our mind relaxes. Because when we are in the woods or in the mountains or at the seaside, these places where we don't have objects that we connect to, or we have fewer things that we need to label, and we're not constantly connecting to our traumas and past thoughts, and our mind can relax more. and one can focus more on external senses without elaborating thousands of things, and this brings us a relaxation.
Andiamo al prossimo.
Let's go to the next one.
Sempa.
Sempa,
Intenzione.
intention. Page
Sempa
22.
kanshena.
Sempen,
Pagina 22. Sempa kanshena sem ngompar du cheba yigi letes gewadang mi gewadang lungto matemba namlas sem juk parchebe lechenos. Cos'è
what is
l'intenzione?
intention? Intention is the mental factor that
È l'azione
is the
della mente
action of the mind
che serve
which
per
functions
dirigere la mente
to
primaria
direct the
al
primary
suo
mind
oggetto di
to its object of
percezione,
perception,
avendo
thus
così la
having the
funzione
function
di
to
applicarsi in
enter
azioni
into
virtuose,
virtuous,
non
non-virtuous,
virtuose
or
o
neutral
neutre.
actions.
Come un magneto
Like a magnet
sposta
moves
il
metal,
metano, il
the
fattore
mental
mentale
factor of
dell'intenzione
intention
muove
moves and
tira la
pulls
mente
the
concomitant in
concomitant
maniera
mind in an
obbligatoria.
obligatory
Ci
manner.
sono 6
There are
differenti
6 different
intenzioni
intentions
basate su
based
ciascuno
on
dei
each
sensi.
of the 6 senses.
La funzione
The function of
dell'intenzione
intention
è quella di
is to
spingere e
push
motivare le
and
azioni del
motivate the
corpo e
actions
della
of body
parola
and
in modo
speech
generale.
in a general way.
L'intenzione
Intention
è il
is karma
stesso.
itself.
Ci troviamo davanti a un oggetto,
Here we are in front of an
abbiamo
object
sensazione.
and we have feeling.
Ok? La sensazione
Feeling, sensation,
naturalmente ci spinge verso
naturally
l'intenzione.
pushes us towards intention.
L'intenzione
Intention,
e sono 3 tipi
and there are
fondamentali di
3
intenzione.
fundamental types of
Quelli che
intention
si basano su
based on
attrazione,
attraction,
la avversione
aversion,
e l'indifferenza.
or indifference.
Quindi quando c'è
So
una
when
sensazione
there's a
piacevole,
pleasurable feeling,
generalmente
generally we generate an intention that's based on attraction. Instead, if the feeling is unpleasant, we generate aversion, and if it's neutral, we generate an indifferent intention. When we see an object, I see a form. I see that object, there's contact. From contact, at the same time, from contact, a feeling arises, and there's also discernment. I look for discernment, and if you want to go into more details, discernment can also generate generate a discernment that is coherent with the previous or not, like as if there are 2 levels of discernment. As soon as there's that feeling, we generate a kind of inner movement in relation to that object. When we see something, there are 3 attitudes that we can have towards that object: attraction, aversion, or indifference. This is the basis. This is the basis that which we interact. We're based on. This is how we work, based on the relationship with every object. So we have a sound that we like, and we have this inner movement towards the object. And if we like it, we want that object, we want it to continue. If we have a feeling that is unpleasant, that we want that object to stop, we have aversion towards it, we don't want it to continue. So intention is the basis of our motivation. It's at the basis of our actions. It's the mental factor that directs us towards the object. And if we recognize, where our actions arise, they come from this mental factor of intention. Our actions come from attraction, aversion, or indifference. And from this attraction, love can manifest, generosity it can it can manifest in many different ways, and these are the other mental functions that then sum up to that mind. But at the basis, we have attraction, aversion, or indifference. This aversion can become anger or aggression. It depends how it develops, but at the basis, there are these three feelings. And this shows us another fundamental aspect, that when we're in front of an object, and and the question, are we able to not be in front of an object of perception? No, and we have six different types. When there's contact, there's inevitably sensation and discernment, and as a result of those two, what is there inevitably? Intention. We direct ourselves towards the object. We're going to interact with that object, and this movement that we do is based on attraction, aversion, or indifference. It's the basis of our motivation. To say, if in reality I have aversion and I try to be kind because it's better for me, but we can't trick ourselves. Our motivation is there, and there is actually aversion. So this is the basis of our motivation. It's the base of our actions, the basis of our actions, the foundation of our actions. It's a reaction to the phenomenon, or it's a reaction to the feeling, to the sensation that we connect to the object. And this is where we generate all our choices. I mean, all of our choices start here. We can, on another level, have a feeling of aversion and then direct it in one way or another, or have a feeling of attraction and direct it in one way or another. I mean, how I manifest it in my speech or physically, or how I elaborate it even mentally, that's another subject. But at the basis, at the foundation, there's this intention where there are present one of these three feelings: attraction, aversion, or indifference. Question. Karma, when we say that intention is karma itself, it's simply the fact that our action comes in that feeling, in that subtle state of attraction, aversion, or indifference. That's where the action begins. It's that first impulse of the action that's karma. To modify it, obviously, depending on the experiences that we've lived, depending on the objects that we come into contact with, the contact, and then according to the feeling and of course the level of discernment, then I'm going to be able to change my karma, change the intention. Intention, often we have intentions, we're not aware of the intention, that are the result of previous experiences. There are conditionings that we're used to. With mindfulness, with awareness, gradually we can apply different meanings. We can change the way that we interact with the same object, and as a result, we can have a different intention. There are intentions that are reactions that we're not aware of, but it is possible to generate an intention that comes from a process of a more aware discernment, even if intention in itself is not a conceptual state of being. Intention is not, oh, I want this because I should do this and because it's the best thing for me and I have attraction for that. It's more visceral. It comes from deeper, on a more instinctive level. But what makes the difference? It's a process of through training. Through training, we can change. The example from before, I heard something I didn't like. Automatically, I have aversion for it. I don't react. I try to see again what was said, and then I heard it differently, and I generated a positive, a pleasant feeling. So this is what can make the difference. So what's really important to understand here is that one important thing is that every time we're in front of an object, we direct ourselves towards the object. We have this impulse towards objects of perception. And this is what, in just a few words, is called karma action. Karma action. And instead of translating karma as action, I think in our language we can call it interaction. So I think I interact verbally, physically, mentally, and these movements that I do inevitably will bring consequences and results. But all of our actions come from the mind, they come from this intention. In the different philosophical schools, these teachings are based on a school called the Sautantrika school. Most Buddhist philosophical schools follow this when concerned with karma. The last one, Madhyamika Prasangika, has a different view. It says karma exists, mental karma exists. That is the mental factor intention, but there's also the karma of speech and action. So there's the karma of the speech and karma of the physical karma of action of the body. The example is if I interact with a person, and the interaction, if it didn't correspond, I mean, the interaction brings a result, even if it doesn't correspond to my intention. An example I always give is, imagine I'm on the 6th floor with children, teaching them how to make a chocolate cake, and the electric oven is catching fire, and so I want to save the children because there's this toxic smoke that's coming out. So I have aversion to the suffering of the children. I want to save the children. So I take the electric stove and I throw it out the window. So it's a positive intention. I have aversion to suffering. That's compassion. It's the attraction to happiness is love. So love and compassion start here with intention. But so here I have this object that seems to be an object of the basis of the suffering of others, and I want to avoid that. that's compassion. So I pick up the oven, I throw it out the window, but it falls on the head of someone, and it kills that person. Or worse, I don't know. It really hurt that person. So did I have intention of aversion towards that person? No. But did I hurt that person? Yes. So that's why it's said that karma, so is the interaction that we generate, this inertia, this strength of that interaction is not only mental, but it also exists on a physical, material level. When I verbalize something beyond what my intention was, the interactions that are created, they're going to bring different results depending on how I act physically beyond my own intention. My physical actions bring consequences. But the first schools give a lot of emphasis to the part of intention, because what gives the most strength to the action is the intention. Even on a karmic, the karmic force, for example, me throwing the oven, if I'm throwing the oven with the desire to kill someone, with aggression and hatred, that karmic force is of one type. If instead I have no idea that there's somebody walking by, my intention is saving the children, I throw the oven, I hurt that person, but that karmic force is different, is much weaker. So intention is determines the action, but it's not enough. There's not only intention, there's also the physical interaction that needs to be taken into consideration. If you, same thing, if you run into someone with awareness, sorry, for an action to be complete, you need intention, which is this mental factor. You need to actually do the action. You need to finish the action, and you need to rejoice from the action. So if you accidentally hit someone, it's not a complete karma. So I see someone, I want to kill that person, I go to kill that person, and then I'm able to do it, and I rejoice for having done it. That makes an action complete. If I hit someone accidentally, the intention wasn't there. There wasn't the movement towards, but there was the completing of the action, and there's no rejoicing for having done that. So I did that action, but that action is not complete. So using the expression karmic point of view, there is a karmic force that exists. Yes, there is an interaction, yes, but it's much, much weaker compared to a complete action, but it's still there. Now, karma, if we open up, we get into an enormous world. There are so many actions that we do without awareness, just in every moment. That do they bring negative results, even if we are not aware of what we're doing? Or if I buy meat, for example, and I'm part of that whole process of deforestation and the suffering of animals being etc. I mean, if we open up this door about karma. There's so many aspects. It's very complex. It's said that the hardest thing to realize, even harder than the correct view of reality, is the complete law of karma. It's said that only a Buddha is able to see an action and understand all of its results, and see the results and understand all the interactions that brought it to be so. So I wouldn't get into too much, but instead let's focus on intention, and it's fundamental to have awareness of our intention and to be sincere with ourselves. If we're able to have sincerity and transparency of our intention, that means already a lot. And I repeat, intention comes from attraction, aversion, and indifference. Sometimes, for example, we show kindness when it's not at all kind, or we try to do in one way, but actually what we want is something else. And it's very important to be aware of our own intention and be able to observe and to see what's happening inside. It's happened to me to have a certain kind of intention, a kind of reaction to something, and block and say, I don't want to take this road, so I'm just going to stop for a minute. I'm going to relive that object again and generate a different feeling, generate a different kind of intention. This is possible. Because there's a difference between, when the intention manifests physically and verbally, and when it doesn't translate into a verbal or physical level interaction. If we're able to have more awareness of our own intention, that will bring us to have more awareness and control over our actions, over our own karma actions. Are we able to see how in every object that we come into contact with there's intention? Even sometimes there's a neutral intention, this indifference, this neutrality towards an object. But very often we're taken by attraction or aversion. And then now when we look at the other mental factors, you'll be able to see how the other mental factors can give more color to these mind. The next mental factor is Yila Cheba, attention. For me, it's always been the hardest to understand. Let's see it. Is intention clear? And the fact that in intention, I say, karma is mostly in the intention, but when we see the Madhyamika Prasangika school, the last of the four schools, karma is mostly intention, but not only. So having good intention is important, but it's not enough. We need also wisdom. This is an important aspect. And then something that came to my mind before, just to say, even when we do things that are not virtuous or accidentally, it happened to me once. I was on the road and I hit a squirrel. At the first moment, I felt sad, of course. I had no intention, no desire to hurt the squirrel. What I did right away was to connect myself with that being and to pray and try to be a benefit of that being, and it brought me another feeling. So I thought, when would I ever be that connected to such a being, which certainly doesn't justify the action, but something so negative became also a condition for something positive. So karma is very, very complex. I will close. Let's close this.
Rimaniamo nel fatto
Let's
della
stay.
nostra intenzione.
Let's stay on the importance of the awareness and sincerity with ourselves when we look at our intention, because we can um, we can imagine, that we're pretending that we don't feel something, when instead we have a different intention. Instead, this level of transparency and sincerity with ourselves is fundamental, and that's one reason why, for example, I think it's important to not materialize actions when they're done with certain types of emotions. Sometimes someone's angry, and the things he says maybe make sense, but maybe they're not wrong, but acting in that moment of anger creates a non-virtuous interaction. So, for example, having this awareness that with certain types of emotions, it's better not to act or speak, and then you can do it later with a different intention, and that changes the nature of the action completely. Let's go to attention. Yila Chepa. This is attention. What is attention? Attention is the mental factor that has the function of directing the primary mind to its object of perception and holding it there. Along with the other associated mental factors, it fixes the mind on specific details of the object of perception, while intention functions to direct the primary mind to the object in a general manner. Attention functions to direct the mind to specific aspects of the object of perception. In other words, attention is the mental factor that keeps the mind on an object. I see an object. I come into contact with an object. I hear an object, whatever. The intention generates a movement towards the object. Attention does what's necessary for us to stay on that object. It grasps the object and stays there. So there's feeling, discernment, and then there's intention, and then this attention that keeps the mind on the object. It's not the movement towards the object. It's simply keeping oneself on the object, because feeling happens immediately, discernment too. Contact, obviously, as we saw it, but without attention, we would just jump from one object to another. We wouldn't be able to stay still on an object. So attention allows us to stay still for a while on an object. Is that clear? So the greater the attention is, the longer we can stay on the object. The weaker the attention is, the quicker we'll move on to another object. Attention is always present. It's what allows us to be on that object, and while there's attention, there's feeling, discernment. Discernment too. Discernment and feeling is not something that just arises and then ceases. As there's contact, there's feeling, there's discernment, there's attention and intention. All of these are present together in relation to an object. In other words, when we come into contact with any object, as long as there's contact, we have sensation, feeling, we have discernment, we stay in contact with that object, that experience continues, so there's attention, we go towards that object, there's intention. Is that clear? So if we see this again, these 5 mental factors, what do they do? The omnipresent mental factors. Through contact, we create the basis for the experience. With contact, feeling arises through which we experience the object. Discernment, we label the object. Attention, we keep our mind still on the object, and with intention we go towards the object. If we go back 2 pages before, page 19, it says, Yongzing Yeshe Gyältsän says, without the 5 omnipresent mental factors, the mind cannot fully experience its object. It doesn't have the ability to fully experience the object of perception without the 5 omnipresent mental factors. Without feeling, there is no experiencing the object. Without discernment, there is no establishing, there's no perceiving, or there's no establishing the specific characteristics of the object. Without intention, there is no directing towards the object. Without attention, there is no stabilizing the object. Without contact, there is no basis for the mind to experience its object. Okay? Does it make more sense now? So in every moment that we perceive any object, we have these 5 aspects of our mind. And something we have this tendency of wanting to see things in boxes. You know, we said that the mind is a constant flow. So if we see in a way, from a certain distance, these 5 they're simultaneous. From my way of seeing, if we were to zoom in and get a little closer, close, first there's contact, and then right away there's feeling. The contact is the basis of the others. There cannot be contact without feeling and discernment, without the contact. And then the intention is a result also of the discernment and feeling. We're not able to have intention without there being sensation, feeling. And intention is, you know, if we look in the 12 links of interdependence, after contact, there's feeling. After feeling, there's sepa. There's called attachment or desire. A desire, it's translated as, which means it's the desire to be happy and not suffer, which is the basis that we generate with intention. Why do we have attraction and aversion? Because in the end, we don't want to suffer. We want to be well. Because there's an attachment, there's a craving to the sense of pleasure, and a natural aversion, which is the same craving as to feelings of suffering, that generates our intention. So this attention allows us to stay, attention allows us to stay fixed on the object. What determines our intention is mostly our feeling and our discernment too. That's why when discernment prevails, is stronger, then we generate another feeling. But it's no longer the external sensory object, it is an inner mental object, the same as we said before. But this is important because in our daily experience, we're people who live in a social context where we think a lot. There are some contexts, people who live in closer contact with nature, plowing the land, or living in a simpler way. There's a lot less of looking back to the past and looking in the future and labeling and giving names. The one has more direct experiences. In our reality, instead, we spend so much time, we put so much energy in mental elaborations. That's why most of our feelings are not physical sensations, feelings, but they're mental. Our intentions are fruit of our mental feelings and not physical ones. With this, we can observe better what's happening. Try to do that exercise. When there's a feeling, and when attraction arises, aversion arises, try to understand what the actual object is. Where does it come from? Is it a mental object or is it a physical object through which that I came into contact with, that brought me this feeling that I was able to label thanks to my discernment, etc. And with this, we conclude the 5 omnipresent mental factors. And these are always there. They're always there. Always there. There's Tsorwa Dushe Tsempa, Ila Chepa Rekpa, feeling, discernment, intention, attention, and contact. Are these 5 clear? Beyond these 5, let's say these are the basic, the main ingredients to our dish. And now let's look at the other mental factors. Let's go back to page 16. We have the Yulnega, the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, and then we're going to look at them. Yul means object, Neba means to ascertain. So when they're present, the more present they are, the stronger the experience of the object is. Then we have the 11 wholesome, virtuous mental factors that bring happiness and pleasure mid-long term. Then we have the 6 root afflicting mental factors, negative mental factors. The word in Tibetan, Sanyun, Sawa means root, and Nyun comes from Nyowo, which is the definition. Nyowo is Sem Rapt. That mental defilement. So that when it is present brings the mind to a strong sense of non-peace, unpeacefulness. So it's a strong state of unpeacefulness. So when you have an attachment to desire, for example, is one in peace with oneself, or a state of unpeacefulness? The same thing for ignorance and anger or doubt, and also for wrong views. These are so for desirous attachment, anger, arrogance, ignorance, indecisive wavering, and deluded view. These are the 6 root mental defilements, let's say, afflicting mental factors, and then the 20 secondary afflicting mental factors they come from these 6 root mental defilements. Then we also have the 4 variable mental factors. Variable because they change, because they can be positive or negative according to who they're with. So if they, in their own nature, they're not neither positive nor negative. Let's remember that these 51 are cited, but there are many, many more. These are the 51 main mental factors that Buddha described, but it doesn't exclude other mental factors that are present. It's a way, how to say, to analyze, and luckily we're very similar. So what works for one works for everyone. So these 51 mental factors, even if they were taught 2,500 years ago, it's valid today, works today. I just wanted to remind you that there can be more mental factors, that there are more mental factors. In any case, we follow this division of 51 mental factors. Let's look at them. So just to recap, we have the 5 omnipresent mental factors, the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, the 11 wholesome positive mental factors, the 6 root afflicting mental factors, the 20 secondary afflicting mental factors, and the 4 variable mental factors. The 5 omnipresent mental factors we've already seen. So now let's look at the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, page 23. Yul Nenga. The 5 object ascertaining mental factors, or object determining mental factors, determine the strength of a thought, or rather, the capacity of grasping the object. They are aspiration, firm apprehension, mindful recollection, concentration, and wisdom. They don't necessarily all need to be present, and they can even not be present at all in a primary mind. I think that's quite clear, isn't it? These mental factors have the power to reinforce the perception of the object. They can all be present, or 1 or 2 can be present. They don't have a precise order. For there to be the third, you need the first and the second. No, it can be there can be the last one, and the other 4 not be present at all. Let's see. And so we have aspiration, we have firm apprehension, we have mindful recollection, concentration, and wisdom, or so wisdom. Let's start with the first one, Dumpa, aspiration. What is aspiration? Aspiration is the mental factor that has the aspect of wishing to have or do something in relation to one's own object of desire. Its function is to be the basis of effort. It is the mental factor that directs the mind to one's own object of desire in order to obtain it. There are 3 forms of aspiration: the aspiration to meet the object, the aspiration not to be separated from the object, and the aspiration to wish for something. The function of aspiration is to give rise to effort. In other words, aspiration is what we call desire. What's the difference between intention and aspiration? Intention is directly connected to the moment, and at that immediate moment, come into contact with something and I generate attraction, aversion, or indifference towards the object in that immediate moment, what I have in front of me. Aspiration, instead, is towards something that goes beyond that. Aspiration is based on a mental image of something that I want. I see the object, I have attraction, or I see the object, I have aversion to it, and to eliminate that, or to get it, I project myself onto something else still. I see a being that is suffering. I don't like seeing suffering of others. So I generate a feeling of suffering, seeing the suffering of others. So I generate aversion to the suffering of the other. This, to eliminate the suffering of the other, then I project an aspiration to develop my own qualities to help that being not suffer. For example, bodhicitta is based on two aspirations. When we go to see what bodhicitta is based on the mental factor of aspiration. There are two different types of aspiration. So for one's own benefit and for the aspiration for the benefit of others. In one case, it's the aspiration, I want the other to be free of suffering, and the other aspiration, for the other to be free of suffering, I need to develop my own qualities. So I desire to become a Buddha, to be able to help the other not suffer. So aspiration is something that looks towards the future, something to obtain, an object to realize, and it's the basis of effort. Without aspiration, there's no effort. Aspiration, in some cases, we can call it desire, is that which allows us to go forward, to generate the strength, the effort to do something. It's fundamental. I don't know, give you an example. At a certain point, I have a feeling of hunger. It's of the five senses. It's a tactile sense. So I'm hungry. I have this feeling of hunger. So that brings an unpleasant feeling, and I have this attention of aversion towards hunger. I can stay there, or I can project myself onto, I want to find food. So I have aspiration to go to a restaurant, and this gives me the effort, the strength to get up and go towards a restaurant so I can eat. So there's a strong connection between intention and aspiration, but intention is something more basic. Instead, aspiration is much more mental, where we direct ourselves towards something, where we desire something. And aspiration is fundamental for anything that we want to realize in our lives. So the basis, the foundation is aspiration, desire, because it's easier to translate it as desire, even if desire is used for another mental factor later. Because desire in this, be it positive or negative, is aspiration. Instead, has a negative connotation as the word desire, but aspiration is a form of desire, if you want to look at it in this way. Depends on how you use the word But what's important is aspiration is the strength of directing ourselves towards something we want. Without aspiration, there's no basis to direct the action, to put energy into that thing. That's why aspiration is one of the most important mental factors. I think that we've all experienced to be in front of an object, to have a feeling of pleasure or a non-pleasant feeling, and to be without any type of aspiration. Some kind of depressed state. The state of depression is connected to what? This inability to move towards something. One stays there. One doesn't even have the strength to even desire it. It's that lack of the lack of allowing ourselves to dream, to want something. Instead, aspiration says, okay, I don't like where I am, but I can do differently. I want something. And it's a very, very important strength. Sometimes you hear in Buddhism, one needs to eliminate desire, but often we confuse and we think desire is aspiration. Instead, no, it's fundamental. This energy at the basis of desiring, of wanting something, aspiring to something. It's the gateway to the spiritual path. Nechung in Tibetan, Nechung, translated as is the certainty of being to emerge, definite emergence, love for oneself, often said, translated as Nechung is
vivere I risultati. Io voglio uscire dal samsara. Questo voglio uscire dal samsara.
Renunciation, this desire of wanting to renounce to the suffering of samsara. You can find that in aspiration. Without aspiration, we're just stopped. Without aspiration, we're just there, taking the blows. A little bit like without aspiration, there's attraction, there's aversion, but we stay in that present moment and we don't direct ourselves towards the future. Aspiration is what allows us to direct ourselves to the future, and if that comes about, that's another story. But it's this directing our lives. It's more than being important, it's fundamental. So when we come into contact with an object, the example I gave before, I come into contact with hunger, or I have aversion for hunger, and I have this intention to eliminate my hunger, and together with that I can have the aspiration, the mental factor of aspiration that goes towards something. What do I want so that I won't be hungry anymore? At this point, I direct myself towards the restaurant where I can find food, etc., etc. It depends on where I direct my energy. I feel a feeling of suffering for whatever it is. I have aversion towards that suffering. I recognize that my suffering is caused by my own selfishness and ignorance. I want to get out of samsara. I don't want to suffer anymore. That's an aspiration. What triggers that aspiration? That sensation of suffering of that moment. So that's why we say in Tibetan, this comes from the Bodhisattva Charavatara that says, Without suffering, there is no desire to get out of suffering. There's no renunciation. Nature. So I feel a feeling of suffering, regardless of the context. I have this intention of not suffering anymore. That's normal. But it depends on where I project myself to not suffer. I can be in a situation, a suffering situation, and have the aspiration to kill what I have in front of me. And whether I do it or not is another story. Or I can recognize that my suffering is connected directly to my selfishness and have the desire to kill my selfishness. So it's where we direct ourselves. I have a feeling. I have a feeling of that's pleasant or unpleasant. Where do I project my happiness? This is aspiration to against the suffering or towards this pleasure. So all the choices we make, inner and outer, depend mostly on our aspiration. And when sometimes I use the term desire is the most important thing that exists, and without desire, we don't do what we don't want to do. In those contexts, what I mean is aspiration. So the function of aspiration is to give rise to effort, putting energy into something. And if we look at the 12 links of interdependence, we have what's called desire and then attachment. So I'm not so fond of these attractions, but we have our senses, contact. From contact, feeling arises, and from the sensation comes the craving, this desire. I don't want to suffer. I want to be happy. It's this attraction to happiness and aversion to suffering. And in our mental factors, it's intention. And after craving, we have attachment, where I project my happiness or my suffering. What do I do to be happy and not suffering? And that's aspiration that can be translated into choices and actions in mental, physical, verbal actions. One aspect, in my opinion, that today is lacking is and a point where we can work on is aspiration. Let's be sincere. Are we able to do much with our intention? What we can do with intention is to follow an intention or not. But when there's that feeling of pleasure, there's attraction. When there's a feeling of suffering, there's aversion. The key is, where do I project? What do I want to get? Even in Tantra, when we talk about transforming desire into the path, transforming aversion into the path, the key is the fact that if I have a strong feeling of attachment to pleasure, happiness, desire, the fundamental point is where I project that. If I have a strong aversion to suffering, where do I project that? So we get back to our aspiration. In Tantra, it said that feeling, that movement of attraction towards happiness and aversion to suffering is not a problem. The problem is where we direct that feeling. We shouldn't try to block that feeling, but instead we should redirect it. We direct it in a correct way. So most of our free will can be found in aspiration. This is something we can learn direct, that we can cultivate, even when we use the term to generate our motivation, Tsongkhapa in Tibetan. When we say in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, I take refuge until enlightenment with the practice of generosity and the other perfections, may I obtain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. We are generating an aspiration. So with awareness, we generate an aspiration. So a key for us is to generate positive aspirations, direct our energy onto something beneficial opposed to something non-beneficial. And once you have generated that aspiration again and again, it comes spontaneously. So aspiration has a very strong component of our past experiences, our paradigm that we live in, the information we've received. These influence it strongly. But I repeat just one more time, it's something fundamentally important. Because if we don't have aspiration, we just stay just stuck in a kind of a constant state of reaction, and it keeps us from having actions that are done with awareness. So to generate actions, mindful actions, we need aspiration. I think for today we can stop here. Let's not open up another one, another mental factor. And just to conclude aspiration, there's a verse from a text called Labi Samaya Alankara, the clear ornament of realization, written by a Sangha, taught by Buddha Maitreya. It said, the generation of the mind is for the benefit of beings, for the benefit of others, and in desire, to desire the highest realization. So here that makes reference to the two aspirations of bodhicitta. So renunciation and bodhicitta are based on aspiration. It's cultivating aspiration, cultivating what I want, where I want to go. It's fundamental. Even if we see the definition of bodhicitta, so the name in aspiration in Tibetan is Dumpa, Shunden Dupa. Now I can't remember. I know I've lost it, but it makes reference. In just the translation is for the to benefit others. Aspiration and the aspiration to reach one's own qualities at maximum level to help beings out of suffering. That's the basis of bodhicitta. So when we see aspiration, it's where we see our qualities that we want to develop for our path. And they start with aspiration. It's aspiration that determines how we live our life, what we do. It's a fundamental mental factor that has this ability to be generated, and it's in aspiration. Aspiration makes the difference between reacting or acting with awareness. It's time to make our dedications.
kotse rapten chin namkra tinle chokchur gepadang losan tempe dreme sasumgi drove minsel taktu ne gyur chi kewa kuntu yanda lamadang dralme cheki pela longche ching sada lamge yente rabzone dorje change kopa nyur tobe sho nimodele tsendele nime kunyan delek shing delek pe kuncho sumke chingi lo kuncho sumke ngodrubutso trashi sho
at dawn or at dusk, at night or midday. May the three jewels grant us their blessings. May they help us to achieve all realizations and sprinkle the path of our lives with various signs of auspiciousness.
At dawn or dusk, at night or midday, may the three jewels grant us their blessings. May they help us to achieve all realizations and spring all the path of our lives with the various signs of auspiciousness. Omahum Tumbalame Sangye Rinpoche, Kyobalame Tamcho Rinpoche, Drimbalame Gendurim, Kyabne Kuncho Sumla Chepa. Buon appetito.
Have a good lunch. Thank you, everyone.